The massive orbital station hung in the void like a crystal palace, its gleaming surfaces reflecting the light of distant stars. Inside its grand assembly hall, beings from across the galaxy had gathered for what they called the most important meeting in centuries. The Galactic Reconstruction Council was finally ready to discuss how to rebuild the worlds that had been destroyed in the recent wars. Ambassador Sephora floated gracefully near the center of the hall, her body made of living crystal that caught and scattered light in beautiful patterns. She was the representative of the Altarian Collective, a species known throughout the galaxy for their careful planning and methodical approach to everything. Her crystalline fingers moved slowly as she reviewed the day's agenda on her advanced holographic display. Nearby, the delegate from Kepler 44 to be made soft clicking sounds that his translator converted into words of agreement. Giant insect with 4 arms and compound eyes that reflected the room's soft lighting. His species had spent thousands of years perfecting their technology, and their ships could travel between stars faster than any other known race. Around the circular hall, other beings sat at their designated positions. There were the tall, graceful vegans with their silver skin and telepathic abilities. The squid-like creatures from Proxima Centauri floated in special water-filled chambers, their tentacles dancing as they communicated through color changes. Each species had brought their most advanced technology, their finest minds, and their most detailed plans for reconstruction. Then there were the humans. Captain Jiwoo walked into the hall, carrying nothing but a simple translation. Device clipped to her ear and an old leather briefcase that had seen better days. She wore a plain blue uniform that looked almost primitive, compared to the flowing robes and biomechanical suits of the other delegates. Her black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years in space. The other delegates noticed her entrance. Many of them exchanged glances. The humans were new too. Galactic politics, having only achieved faster-than-light travel a few decades ago. Their technology was crude by galactic standards, their ships held together more by determination than advanced engineering. Most species considered them barely civilized, certainly not qualified to participate in discussions about rebuilding entire worlds. Gu took her assigned seat at the far end of the hall, opened her briefcase, and pulled out a simple notebook and pen, while the other delegates activated their Neuralink interfaces and holographic displays. She simply sat quietly and prepared to take notes by hand. Ambassador Zephyra began the meeting with a presentation that lasted nearly 2 hours. She spoke about sustainable reconstruction through methodical resource allocation, using words that sounded impressive but said very little. Her holographic charts showed timelines that stretched across decades, with careful phases of planning, environmental assessment, and resource distribution. The insectoid delegate from Kepler 44 to B followed with his own presentation about the importance of proper impact studies. He explained that before any reconstruction could begin, teams of scientists would need to spend years studying each damaged world to understand the full extent of the problems. Only then could they begin to develop solutions. One by one, each species presented their plans. The vegans spoke about the need for psychological healing and the importance of meditation centers in rebuilding communities. The Proxima Centaurians discussed advanced bioremediation techniques that could clean poisoned soil and water, but would require extensive testing before implementation. All of their presentations had one thing in common. They were slow, careful, and methodical. Every species emphasized the importance of taking time to plan properly, to avoid mistakes, to ensure that their reconstruction efforts would be perfect before they began. Throughout all of this, Yu sat quietly and listened. She occasionally wrote something in her notebook, but mostly she just observed. The translator in her ear buzzed softly as it converted the various alien languages into words she could understand. Sometimes she frowned slightly, as if she was having trouble believing what she was hearing. The other delegates began to notice her silence. Some of them exchanged amused glances, clearly thinking that the human was overwhelmed by the complexity of the discussions. Others looked at her with pity, assuming that she simply didn't understand the sophisticated concepts being presented. As the hours passed, the presentations became more and more elaborate. The delegates talked about forming committees to study the feasibility of forming other committees. They discussed the need for environmental impact assessments that would take years to complete. They debated the proper procedures for requesting permission to begin planning permission requests. Ji-woo continued to sit quietly, occasionally checking her simple wristwatch. Her expression remained neutral. But there was something in her eyes that suggested she was thinking about things very differently than everyone else in the room. Finally, after nearly 6 hours of presentations, Ambassador Zephora turned to the human delegate. "Captain Ji-woo," she said, her crystalline voice carrying a tone of polite condescension. "Would you like to share humanity's perspective on galactic reconstruction?" Ji-woo closed her notebook and stood up slowly. Every eye in the hall turned toward her, and the room fell silent for the first time all day. Gu walked to the center of the great hall, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. The other delegates watched her with curious eyes, expecting another long presentation filled with charts and complicated words. Instead, she reached into her old leather briefcase and pulled out something that made several aliens lean forward. In surprise, it was a simple photograph, printed on actual paper. In a room filled with holographic displays and advanced technology, the small piece of paper looked almost ancient. Gi-woo placed it carefully on the central display table, where Di-woo wore. Everyone could see it. The photograph showed a city that had been completely destroyed. Buildings lay in piles of broken stone and twisted metal. Smoke rose from fires that still burned among the ruins. The streets were filled with rubble, and the sky was dark with ash and dust. But in the middle of all this destruction, small figures could be seen moving through the wreckage. They carried shovels and buckets, and even though the city was ruined, they were already working to clean it up. "This is Seoul, 1953, Gi-woo said in a quiet voice that somehow carried to every corner of the hall. "My great-grandmother was there when this picture was taken. She was one of those people with shovels." The alien delegates stared at the photograph. They had seen destroyed cities before, but something about this image was different. Maybe it was the way the people in the picture kept working even though everything around them was broken. Maybe it was the determination in their small figures as they moved through the ruins. Before anyone could ask questions, Gyu placed a second photograph next to the first one. This picture showed the same location, but it looked completely different. Where there had been rubble and smoke, now there were tall, gleaming buildings reaching toward the sky. Wide streets filled with cars and people stretched in every direction. Gardens and parks added green spaces between the modern towers. The city was not just rebuilt, it was better than it had ever been before. "This is Seoul, 1970, Ji-woo said 17 years later. The chamber became so quiet that the only sound was the soft humming of the station's life support systems. Ambassador Zephora's crystalline body flickered with confusion, her light patterns shifting in ways that showed she was trying to process what she was seeing. "Surely you don't mean to suggest such rapid reconstruction without proper environmental studies, resource allocation protocols?" And she began, her voice rising with each word. "I mean to suggest," Ji-woo interrupted, her voice calm but firm, "that while you speak of rebuilding, we speak through firestorms." She pulled out a small device from her briefcase, a primitive holographic projector that looked crude compared to the advanced technology around the room. But when she activated it, the images it showed were more powerful than any sophisticated. Displayed, the first image showed a human city rising from what looked like a nuclear wasteland. The ground was still black and poisoned, but humans were there anyway, building new homes and planting gardens in the toxic soil. They wore simple protective gear and worked with basic tools, but they never stopped working. The second image showed a human colony on a world that was still being bombed. Explosions lit up the sky in the distance, but the colonists continued building their settlement. They worked at night, using the light from the bombardment to see what they were doing. When morning came, they had made progress despite the danger. The third image showed human rescue ships diving into an active war zone. The ships were old and patched, held together with repairs and determination. They flew through enemy fire and burning debris, to reach trapped civilians on a planet that other species had already given up as lost. The insectoid delegate from Kepler-44 to B made rapid clicking sounds, and his translator worked overtime to convert his agitation into words. This is ... reckless, inefficient. Where are your impact studies, your long-term sustainability matrices? How can you build without proper planning? Gi-Wu turned to face him, and for the first time since entering the hall, she smiled. Not a happy smile, but one filled with grim understanding of truths that the other species had never learned. We don't have time for studies when people are dying, she said simply. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Round the hall, the alien delegates shifted uncomfortably. Their advanced minds, trained in careful planning and methodical approaches, struggled to understand this human concept of acting without extensive preparation. The vegan delegate, tall and silver-skinned, spoke up with confusion in her telepathic voice. But without proper planning, how do you know if your actions will be successful? How do you avoid making mistakes that could make things worse? Gi-Wu looked at her with eyes that had seen too much of the galaxy's suffering. We make mistakes, she admitted. Lots of them. But we make them quickly, learn from them quickly, and try again. Every failure teaches us something new. Every mistake makes us better at helping people. She gestured to the photographs on the table. My great-grandmother didn't wait for committees to tell her it was safe to start cleaning up. So, she picked up a shovel and started working. When she made mistakes, she learned from them and kept working. When other people told her it was impossible, she showed them it wasn't. The hall remained silent as the aliens processed this alien concept of learning through action rather than study. The moment Gi-Wu finished speaking, the Great Hall erupted into chaos. Delegates from across the galaxy began talking at once, their voices rising as they argued about what they had just heard. The air filled with the sounds of clicking, buzzing, and the musical tones of various alien languages as the translators worked overtime. Ambassador? Zephyr's crystalline body flashed, with angry red light as she stood up from her floating chair. This is exactly what we mean by dangerous impulsiveness, she declared, her voice carrying clearly over the noise. Humans rush into situations without thinking about the consequences. They act on emotion rather than logic. The insectoid delegate from Kepler-44 to be nodded his compound head rapidly, his forearms gesturing wildly as he spoke. Our record shows 17 human colonies that have failed in the past 50 years. 17. Each one could have been saved if they had followed proper procedures and waited for adequate support. A delegate from the vegan system, tall and silver-skinned, added her telepathic voice to the criticism. We have documented cases of human rescue missions that went wrong because they did not take time to plan properly. Ships were lost, lives were wasted, all because humans could not wait for the right moment to act. The Proxima Centaurian delegate, floating in his water-filled chamber, changed colors rapidly as he communicated his disapproval. His translator converted the color patterns into words of concern about human, reckless behavior and unsustainable practices. Gi-Wu stood calmly, in the center of the storm of criticism, listening to each complaint without changing her expression. When the voices finally died down enough for her to speak, she nodded thoughtfully. You are right, she said simply. We have failed many times. 17 colonies, exactly as you said. Rescue missions that went wrong, plans that did not work. People who died because we made mistakes. The alien delegates looked surprised. They'd expected her to argue, to defend human actions, not to agree with their criticisms. But, Gi-Wu continued, every failure taught us something. Every mistake made us faster, stronger, more adaptable. You planned for decades to avoid a single error. We fail quickly, learn quickly, and try again. Those 17 failed colonies led to the knowledge that saved 53 others. She walked over to her primitive holographic projector and activated it again. New images appeared, showing human settlements that had succeeded against impossible odds. Each of these colonies exists because we learned from our failures. We did not let the fear of making mistakes stop us from trying to help people. Altarian ambassador's crystals flickered with confusion. but the waste, the inefficiency. Think of all the resources that could have been saved with proper planning. Think of all the lives that would have been lost while we were planning, Dewey replied quietly. The debate continued for another hour, with each species presenting their arguments for careful, methodical approaches to reconstruction. They spoke of committees and studies, of environmental assessments and resource allocation protocols. They used big words and complex theories to explain why taking time to plan was always better than rushing into action through it all. Jiwoo listened, patiently, occasionally nodding or asking a simple question. She did not argue with their logic or challenge their methods. She simply represented a different way of thinking about problems then, as if the universe itself wanted to settle the debate. Emergency alarms began blaring throughout the station. The sudden, piercing sound cut through all conversation, and red warning lights flashed in every corner of the hall. The station's central computer activated the emergency broadcast system. A calm, artificial voice filled the air with words that made every delegate freeze in place. Emergency alert. Solar flare activity has destabilized the orbital platform around Proxima Centauri. 3 million colonists are trapped in a decaying habitat with life support systems failing. Projected time until complete system failure, 72 hours. Nearest rescue fleet, 4 days away. All available ships are requested to respond immediately. The message repeated twice more, then the alarms fell silent. The Great Hall was quiet except for the soft humming of the station's systems, and the nervous sounds of various alien species trying to process what they had just heard. 3 million people, 72 hours. The nearest help was 4 days away. The galactic delegates immediately began doing what they did best, forming committees. Ambassador Zephyr's crystals brightened as she activated her communication systems to contact the Altarian Science Council. We need to study the solar flare patterns, she announced. We must understand the exact nature of the threat before we can develop an appropriate response. The Kepler delegate began rapid calculations on his holographic display. We need to determine the optimal evacuation routes. The gravitational effects of the flare will change normal space-time corridors. This will require extensive computational modeling. The vegan representative started organizing a telepathic conference with her homeworld's emergency planning committee. We must consider the psychological impact on the colonists. Mass evacuation without proper mental preparation could cause panic and make the situation worse. All around the hall, delegates were making calls, forming committees, and beginning the slow, careful process of planning a response to the emergency. Gu was already walking toward the exit. Where are you going? Ambassador Zephora called. After her crystalline voice sharp with confusion. Giwu paused at the doorway and looked back at the room full of delegates, who were still talking about forming committees while 3 million people waited to die. To get our ships, she replied without turning around. We will be there in 36 hours. 36 hours after Jiwoo had left the Galactic Council meeting, the human fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Proxima Centauri system. The ships were not beautiful or elegant like the vessels of other species. They were functional, built for work rather than show. With thick hulls and powerful engines that could push them through almost anything, Commander Minho stood on the bridge of the lead ship, watching the solar storm rage ahead of them. The star was throwing massive flares of radiation and plasma into space, creating a wall of deadly energy that stretched for millions of kilometers. Any normal ship would have waited for the storm to pass, but the human fleet had not come here. To wait, sir, his communications officer called out. We're getting warnings from the other galactic fleets. They're saying it's impossible to get through the storm. Their computer models show that any ship entering the solar wind will be destroyed. Minho looked at the screens showing the failing orbital platform in the distance. 3 million people were trapped inside, and their life support systems were failing. The other species were still debating safety protocols and forming committees to study the problem. Tell them we understand the risks, Minho said calmly. All ships, prepare for storm entry. Emergency protocols are now in effect. The human fleet began moving toward the wall of fire and radiation. As they entered the outer edge of the solar storm, their hulls began to glow with heat. Radiation alarms screamed throughout every ship. and the crew members put on their emergency suits and prepared for the worst. The ships did not have the advanced shielding that other species used. Human technology was simpler, cruder, held together, more by determination than sophisticated engineering. But they had something that no computer could calculate: the willingness to fly through hell itself if lives depended on it. The first transport ship reached the failing orbital platform while pieces of the station were still breaking off and spinning away into space. The platform was coming apart, its metal structure twisted and buckled by the solar storm. Fires burned in several sections. The main power grid was failing. Captain Haijin was the first to dock her ship with the dying station. Her transport shuddered as it connected with the platform, and she could hear the metal groaning under the stress. Through her helmet radio, she could hear the panicked voices of the colonists inside. "This is Captain Haijin," she broadcast to the station. "We're here to get you out. Stay calm and follow our instructions." The evacuation was brutal and chaotic. Human transports docked with the failing station while its superstructure buckled around them. Some docking ports were already damaged, so the crews had to cut their way through the hole with plasma torches. Others found sections of the station that were venting atmosphere into space and had to work in vacuum suits while the wind tried to pull them out into the void. Evacuation pods launched from the station every few minutes, carrying small groups of colonists toward the waiting ships. But the solar storm was making everything dangerous. Fields of plasma drifted through space like burning clouds, and several pods had their outer hulls melted by the intense heat. The human crews worked frantically to retrieve the damaged pods before their occupants suffocated. Combat engineers like Haijin worked in the most dangerous areas of the station, welding emergency bulkheads to keep damaged sections from collapsing. They worked in vacuum with nothing but basic suits and stubborn determination. Against time, as the station tore itself apart around them. The work was exhausting and terrifying. Every few minutes, another section of the station would break away, and the rescue crews would have to evacuate that area quickly. The solar storm made communication difficult, and several times crews lost contact with each other for long periods, but they never stopped working. When one evacuation pod was destroyed by a plasma burst, another crew immediately launched a replacement. When a docking port was damaged beyond repair, engineers cut a new one through the hull. When the station's main power failed, the human ships connected their own power cables to keep the life support systems running, far away from the danger. The galactic delegates watched the rescue operation through their long-range sensors. Their ships remained at a safe distance, monitoring the situation, but not helping. Their computer models still showed that the rescue was impossible, that the human ships should have been destroyed the moment they entered the solar storm. "They're not following any established protocols," the Kepler delegate observed, his translator buzzing with confusion as he watched the chaotic rescue operation. "They're writing new ones," Ambassador Zephora whispered, her crystalline body flickering with colors that might have been awe or fear. The vegan delegate watched in silent amazement as human crews worked in conditions that would have killed any other species. "How are they surviving in that radiation?" she asked. "They're not," replied the Proxima Centaurian delegate, his color shifting rapidly as he processed the sensor data. "Their ships are taking massive damage. Crews are being exposed to deadly levels of radiation. By all logic, they should retreat immediately. But the humans did not retreat. They continued working, pulling colonists from the dying station, even as their own ships began to fail. When one transport's engines died, another ship took its place. When a crew became too sick from radiation exposure to continue, fresh crews took over their work. The rescue continued for 18 hours, long past the point where any other species would have given up. And somehow, impossibly, it worked. When the last human transport ship cleared the dying orbital platform, the final count was broadcast across the galaxy. 2.7 million colonists had been saved. The number seemed impossible to the alien delegates who had watched the rescue from their safe distance. Their computer models had predicted total failure, yet somehow the humans had succeeded. But the success came with a price that was written in scars across every human ship. The vessels that limped back to the gathering point looked like they had been through a war. Their hulls were blackened by radiation, their armor plates warped by heat. And several ships trailed clouds of venting atmosphere from holes that had been quickly patched with emergency seals. The cost was also written in the exhausted faces of the crews who had worked beyond their limits. Many of the rescue workers had been exposed to dangerous levels of radiation and would need months of medical treatment. Some had burns from plasma bursts. Others had injuries from working in the collapsing station. They moved slowly, like people who had pushed their bodies far past what should have been possible. The hardest cost was written in the memorial services for those who had not made it home. 12 human rescue workers had died during the operation. Some had been caught in collapsing sections of the station. Others had been lost when their evacuation pods were destroyed by plasma bursts. Each death was mourned by their crews, but none of them regretted the mission. The other galactic species had lost no one. Their ships had remained at safe distances, monitoring the situation but not participating in the rescue. Their crews were healthy and their vessels undamaged, but they had also saved no one. 3 weeks later, the Galactic Reconstruction Council reconvened in the same Great Hall where the debate had begun, but the atmosphere was completely different now. Delegates no longer looked at the humans with pity or condescension. Instead, they watched Jiwoo and her team with something that might have been respect, or fear, or simple confusion. Ambassador Zephyrus' crystalline body flickered with uncertain colors as she tried to find the right words. Their methods are. She began, then stopped. Her advanced mind, trained in careful analysis and logical thinking, struggled to process what she had witnessed. They should not work. By every calculation, by every model, by every principle of engineering and physics, your rescue should have failed. Gilwoo sat quietly in her simple chair, still wearing her plain blue uniform. She looked tired, older somehow than she had 3 weeks ago. The weight of command and the loss of her crew members had left marks on her face that had not been there. Before they work because they have to, she replied simply. You see destruction and think about how to study it. You see people who need help and figure out how to give it. You plan for perfection. We plan for survival. The insectoid delegate from Kepler 44 to be made nervous clicking sounds as he processed this statement. But the inefficiency, the waste of resources, the risks to your own people? How do you justify such methods? Jiwoo looked at him with eyes that had seen too much suffering to worry about efficiency reports. How do you justify letting 3 million people die while you form committees to study the problem? The hall fell silent. The question hung in the air like a challenge that none of the other delegates could answer. They had spent their entire civilization believing that careful planning and methodical approaches were always superior to hasty action. But the humans had just proven them wrong in the most dramatic way possible. The vegan delegate, tall and silver-skinned, spoke up with her telepathic voice. We have studied your rescue operation extensively. Our analysis shows that you succeeded not because of superior technology or better planning, but because you were willing to accept risks that we would consider unacceptable. That is correct, Jiwoo nodded. We accepted the risk because the alternative was doing nothing. Over the following months, something remarkable happened throughout the galaxy. The Galactic Reconstruction Council began to change the way they approached emergency situations. They created what they called the Human Protocols Emergency, procedures that prioritized immediate action over extended planning. Other species began to study human methods not as examples of recklessness, but as demonstrations of a different kind of wisdom. They learned that sometimes the most sophisticated response to a crisis was not found in careful deliberation, but in the simple willingness to act when action was needed. The humans had shown them that there was more than one way to solve problems. While the galactic species had spent centuries perfecting the art of planning and analysis, humanity had developed something else, the ability to act decisively in the face of uncertainty in the years that followed. When disaster struck anywhere in the galaxy, the first call for help went out not to the most advanced species or the most powerful governments. Because everyone now knew that when worlds were burning and people needed saving, there was only one species that would fly through hell itself to get them. The other species continued to plan and study and form committees. But they also learned to call the humans when there was no time for planning. When people were dying and someone needed to act immediately, Jiwoo had been right. While others spoke of rebuilding, humanity had proven that the most important conversations happen in the middle of the storm. When lives hang in the balance and there is no time for anything but the work itself, the galaxy had learned a new lesson. Sometimes the best plan is simply to start helping people and figure out the details as you go.